Deep sea mining could have long-lasting effects on the bottom of the ocean. But did you ever consider what effects or consequences it might have for some species in the ocean, like whales, sea turtles, seabirds, sharks, and rays? A lot of people haven't really thought about it, including myself, until I talked to my friend, Dr. Andrew Thaler, who just finished an assessment, a gap assessment, on how deep sea mining could affect these types of species. Cetaceans like whales, bottlenose dolphins, or any kind of beaked whale. Or we're looking at sea turtles, or we're looking at seabirds, or we're looking at sharks and skates and rays and all these types of animals, because we think of them at the top of the ocean, and deep sea mining is in the deep sea, so how can they be affected? We're going to talk a bunch about the logistics of actually what mining is, how animals in the water column are going to be affected, aka through noise, what it looks like on the surface, how many ships are going to be there at a full-scale plant or full-scale project where they're actually deep sea mining in the open ocean. We're going to talk all about that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It's a great one. You're not going to want to miss it if you're interested in deep sea mining and its effect on the ocean. So let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, a marine biologist and science communicator, here to tell you what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. Today we're going to be talking about the deep sea because I have a very, very special guest, a recurring special guest, Dr. Andrew Thaler, who's here to talk about a gap assessment, a study that he just completed for the Convention of Migratory Species. We're going to talk about that study, what he found, and we're really going to get into the logistics of what a deep sea mining operation would look like from top to bottom, literally from the surface down to the deep sea, right? And we're going to talk about the different types of deep sea mining and how that could affect the ocean bottom and how that could affect the water column and all that wonderful stuff. So we're going to talk about that. But you know, there's a lot of mystery around deep sea mining and the effects that it can happen because we just haven't studied it completely where we really understand the effects, especially since it hasn't really been done at full scale. So, you know, we don't want to reach that point and be like, hey, you know what we should have done is made regulations to that. So there's a lot of mystery around that, a lot of science that has to be done around that. You know what also there needs to be done? There needs to be done a lot of science in a lot of other habitats in the ocean, including seagrasses. Seagrasses, it has a special place in my heart. I almost did a PhD on seagrasses. I've been always following seagrass. I've always been interested in the habitat we call seagrass because it's productive, it's biodiverse, it's an important habitat, coastal habitat for the ocean and for its species, for other habitats such as mangroves and such as coral reefs and other places. It's something that we need to talk about that we don't talk about enough. So what I wanted to do is I want to start and launch a podcast called The Seagrass Effect. Because this podcast, How to Protect the Ocean, is about people, it's to help you understand more of what's happening with the ocean, I want to crowdfund this podcast because it takes money to do it. It takes time. I want to do this. I love doing this. I love talking about seagrasses, but I want to share seagrass science, research, conservation, and restoration projects around the world, not only to bring the research community, the conservation and restoration community together about seagrasses, but I also want to help restore seagrasses. So with this crowdfunding, not only will we share the information on seagrasses, but we're going to help restore seagrass habitats around the world. And I can't wait to do that, but I need your help. I need you to help crowdfund this. I need your donations if you are willing to do this. If you see the same thing I see around seagrasses, go to speakupforblue.com/seagrass to be able to donate today. It's speakupforblue.com/seagrass. I want to thank the partners and the crowdfunding platform Balian for helping us, Balian.org. That's where you're going to find the project, but go to speakupforblue.com/seagrass, goes right to my funding page. Find more information on the podcast. I can't wait. I'd love to hear what you think about that. I'm looking to launch that as soon as possible. All right, let's get back into the show. Andrew emailed me a couple of days ago and said, hey, you ready to podcast? And I'm like, absolutely. I'm always ready to podcast. I knew there was a bunch of stuff coming out with deep sea mining. He's done a study on the gap analysis, looking at where the gaps are for migratory species that could be affected by deep sea mining. And I was like, how is that going to happen? How are they going to be affected? And he broke it down for me, and it was wonderful. So without further ado, I want you to listen to this entire interview with Dr. Andrew Thaler talking about the effects of deep sea mining on migratory species like cetaceans, which are whales, seabirds, sea turtles, sharks, rays, skates, all these animals that have a profound effect on the deep sea, but also in the ocean, and we don't want them to be harmed. So we're going to talk about that. Here's the interview. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Andrew Thaler, welcome back to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about not only deep sea mining, but migratory species in the ocean and how they can be affected by deep sea mining?
Absolutely, I am. I am so excited for this one.
I love it. This is going to be definitely an interesting episode because when you emailed me, you'd be like, "Hey, Andrew, you ready for a podcast?" I'm like, "I am ready." I'm always ready for a podcast with you, Andrew. It's always fun to have you on. But we're gonna like when you mention what you've been up to lately and the study that you did on behalf of, you're going to talk about who it's on behalf of and so forth. And I'm like, oh, this is an interesting angle. I've got a lot of questions that we're going to ask just in terms of how this came to be and what those results are and, what we're going to do in the future about this and some of the implications that can have. So it's going to be really interesting to talk about. But before we do, why don't you just remind us of who you are and what you do?
Sure thing. I am Dr. Andrew Thaler. I am a deep sea ecologist, a conservation technologist, and an ocean educator. And I work on issues surrounding how humans use and misuse technology to explore and exploit the deepest places in the world.
Awesome. Love to hear that. What's interesting too is let's just kind of go. You've been on the podcast multiple times. I think
we've done a few.
Yeah, we've done a few, especially and especially on deep sea mining. When we first had you on, or when you were on at one point, we talked about your history with deep sea mining, doing your deep sea ecology PhD on deep sea mining, and you've been in charge of the Deep Sea Mining magazine. You've gone to all of the International Seabed Authority, well, not all, but you've been to
not
the
all
International
of them
because
they banned me for a while.
Right. But you've been following them, and you've been giving me information as well as thousands of other people who read Southern Fried Science, who follow you on your Patreon, and maybe you've even mentioned it in some of your D&D games with some of the local kids when you talk about forestry. But you've done a lot, and you've been on here, and you are an expert in this. And I'm glad to have you on to talk about this. We've seen deep sea mining continue to be in the news, somewhat underlining the news, where people like mention it, and you can almost see people roll their eyes, like, "Oh yeah, we got to worry about that." Okay, and then some people are like, "Well, how is it going to really affect me? Like, is it really that big of a deal?" And then I go into a whole tirade. I'm like, "I've got podcasts for you to listen to. Just bear with me." But it's always an interesting kind of situation. We've talked about the different types of deep sea mining and where they could mine from. We've talked about some of the areas. We talked about some of the gaps. Now today we're going to be talking about some of the gaps in knowledge, but with migratory species and how deep sea mining could affect migratory species. Can we start from the beginning of where the idea came from and why, and then how you got involved in it?
Absolutely. And kind of before we get into that, I just want to ask you a very important question.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you know about eels?
Eels. Well, I know they migrate. They go. There's two eel species, I believe, the European and then the American eel. We actually get some eels up here in the Great Lakes, and they kind of congregate. Both species congregate in the Gulf of Mexico, I believe, or Sargasso Sea kind of area.
Sargasso Sea.
And then they go back up to, one goes up to Northern Europe, and then the other one comes over here.
Exactly. So I'm a deep sea ecologist. I'm a benthic man. Most of my life has been spent looking at snails.
Right.
You could live an entire life and only look at snails and be satisfied. But I was contracted by the Convention on Migratory Species, which is a UN organization that is tasked with managing specific kinds of wildlife that travel across borders. So highly migratory species that move between borders. The ones that, if you're going to manage them, they have to be managed collectively. You can't manage them country by country. Mm-hmm. Well, one of those animals is, of course, the common eel or European eel. The European eel, as an adult, it sets sail from the coasts of Europe, crosses the Atlantic, it reproduces in the Sargasso Sea, spawns in the Sargasso Sea, dies in the Sargasso Sea, and then its offspring, which are in the form of these tiny little, almost transparent glass eels, migrates back across the Atlantic Ocean, settles again in Europe, grows up, grows big, 5 to 25 years later repeats that process. The migration across the Atlantic can take 18 months to 2 or 3 years. So it's a very long process. Yeah. And one of the things that happens when you migrate across the Atlantic is you migrate across the mid-Atlantic ridge.
Right.
And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, as many of your listeners know and as we've talked about, is a site of tremendous hydrothermal activity and a place where multiple mining companies are looking at exploiting polymetallic sulfides on the seafloor. So the International Seabed Authority, this organization that oversees mining in the high seas, is issuing lease blocks in areas outside of any nation's boundaries, currently just for exploration, not for exploitation, so no one's mining anything yet.
Right.
And one of the things that the Convention on Migratory Species wants to know is, a lot of the environmental work that's been done around deep sea mining, all of the environmental baseline work today that I've done around deep sea mining is focused on the seafloor, looking at what impacts mining is going to have on the benthic communities. It's looking at impacts of the mining plume on midwater communities. But one of the things that hasn't really been looked at with a lot of effort has been the big animals, the migratory species that are moving through these areas, that are really connected to the global ocean, that are traveling around the world as part of their migration, as part of their feeding, as part of their reproduction and foraging behavior, and will encounter these mining sites throughout their lives. So a weird, quirky thing that happened in the process of this is, I started with fish because I thought, okay, fish are probably the thing I'm the least familiar with because I do benthic stuff. I had just come off of some work with the International Whaling Commission, so I knew quite a bit about what was going on with marine mammals. Fish and seabirds were going to be the big heavy lift ones for me. Discovered that, the Convention on Migratory Species doesn't oversee a lot of bony fish because many of the commercially important ones are covered under other treaties. And most of the ones that the convention covers are ones that we usually think of as anadromous or riverine fish. So they have a lot of sturgeons involved, and sturgeons aren't particularly at risk of going offshore and running into mining sites. But they do cover European eels. And European eels, we tracked their migration patterns as far as we know, and they do migrate right over some of these lease blocks that have already been issued and are currently being explored. So one of the first things that came out of this study was, I have been working in deep sea mining since 2008. It had never even occurred to me that eels might be an issue for impact studies. And now I'm like, eels are pretty important to the European economy. They're an incredibly crucial fishery. They're a fishery that is under tremendous threat. And now perhaps there will be a new threat to them if mining on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge gets underway. So that's kind of the aegis of this project is, to look at the migratory species, to take the known ranges and the known routes of the migratory species that we have tracked in the past, to see where they interact with known and proposed deep-sea mining sites, and to figure out what the potential impacts to these animals will be. So we looked at whales and dolphins, cetaceans. We looked at bony fish, which ended up just being European eels, and I ended up spending a lot of time on European eels because eels are really cool. We looked at sharks, skates, and rays, and they have some very interesting interactions with mining sites. We looked at marine reptiles, which is mostly turtles, though there are some other reptiles that are a little bit more coastal and aren't going to see much impact from deep-sea mining. And we looked at seabirds to see what kinds of seabirds would be interacting with these potential mining sites.
So when we talk about deep sea mining, like you mentioned it before, we think about the bottom of the ocean. So a lot of times we're thinking 3,000 meters deep, maybe more in certain spots, maybe a little bit less too. But we're never really thinking about the upper parts of the water column. Where a lot of these species, we think, this is where we think these species are. Marine mammals, they have to breathe, so they come to the surface. Sea turtles have to breathe, they come to the surface. Sharks, we know certain sharks will stay up top, in the shallows, and then others will be deep sea sharks, or that some will go into the deeper waters. Seabirds, well, they fly, so they're, if they're going to eat, they're probably going to stay pretty close to the surface. So when we, I'm sure there are some people who are listening to this being like, why are we concerned with the species that are staying so high up? Is that an impact for deep sea mining? When you answer that, can you also talk just a bit about what the process is going to look like when, say, an operation like deep sea mining happens, it's not drilling per se. It's taking stuff off the surface. But my understanding is there might be a sediment plume. So I can see like benthic stuff getting obviously disturbed. Talk about like where in the water column are we looking at, or are we predicting these disturbances to happen? How far up, how far down, so forth?
Yeah, so there are three major ore deposits that are being targeted. The deepest are what we call polymetallic nodules, and they occur at about 6,000 meters depth. And these are the little cobblestones that you'll see on the seafloor that are being targeted because they are fairly abundant in cobalt and copper and nickel, depending on where in the world they're forming. You also get cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, and these are crusts that form on the sides of seamounts. And so they can be as shallow as 8 to 1,000 meters, or they can be tremendously deep if you have very deep seamounts. And then the third
But they're on the sides of the seamounts. They're not at the top. They're on the sides.
They're kind of forming all around the seamount.
Oh, okay.
They kind of become the hard substrate of the seamount.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then you have seafloor massive sulfides, or in ecology speak, deep sea hydrothermal vents. And they occur anywhere from 1,000 meters to 6,000 meters deep. And these are those kind of lush, vibrant communities of chemosynthetic organisms that are growing around, like these active vent plumes that are belching black smoke into the water column. And they're interesting because they're not particularly targeted for critical minerals. So with cobalt crusts and with nodules, people are talking about, it's critical minerals, it's national security. With hydrothermal vents, it's gold, mostly. It's gold, it's silver. There's copper as well. When you think of metals that occur in veins, it's like a vein of gold, a vein of copper. Those veins, even on land, are ancient hydrothermal vent stockworks. And there are some cool places where if you go to Cyprus and look at the gold mines in Cyprus, you can find fossil tube worms from 10 million year old, 100 million year old hydrothermal vents.
Wow.
So functionally speaking, up until the last half century, every gold mine and every copper mine is likely an ancient hydrothermal vent.
That's insane.
But the process is different depending on the ore body you're looking at. So in the cobalt rich crusts and the seafloor massive sulfides, they're using cutting machines that will grind down the topology. Both of them are three-dimensional structures. You have to grind down the topology to get the ore out, and that ore is pumped to the surface. As it's pumped to the surface, it has to be dewatered, and then there's a metal-rich dewatering plume that is pumped back down, usually into the midwater, depending on who's doing a proposal. With polymetallic nodules, it's not quite as violent in operation because the nodules are just sitting on the seafloor. So they're being plucked from the seafloor either mechanically with like mechanical arms or like a collecting device, or via vacuum pumps. And then the nodules themselves are pumped to the surface, dewatered plume returned. There's a couple other different proposals that have slightly different processes, but for the most part, it is the pump the ore to the surface, dewater it, release the dewatering plume in the midwater. So when we're talking about impacts to highly migratory species, there's the direct impacts to the animals themselves. There's also indirect impacts. And one of the first things we looked at are what are kind of the compounding impacts, the way that these indirect impacts can compound on top of them. When you destroy a benthic environment, if that benthic environment is a source of food or habitat or structure for migratory species, then they lose access to that as well. So one of the most extreme cases we have is that in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is an area where they're mining polymetallic nodules, and it's 6,000 meters deep, they find gouges on the seafloor. And those gouges look an awful lot like the feeding scars produced by beak whales. So right now, the maximum recorded depth of a beaked whale is 3,000 meters. Clarion-Clipperton zone, 6,000 meters deep. So if these gouges turn out to be feeding scars, that doubles the known diving depth of an as yet unknown species of beaked whale.
And how would
it's possible we know what the species is, but we don't know which species is doing it right now.
How would they confirm that it is a beaked whale?
You'd have to observe it.
You'd have to see it happen.
You have to see it.
So it's not as if they can look at the gouges and like take some samples or whatever and like
the gouges look very consistent with shallower beaked whale gouges. I think the researchers I know who work on them are very confident that it is a beaked whale feeding scar.
That's crazy.
But it hasn't been
double,
released yet.
double
Their maximum
That's
diving depth.
insane.
That would be incredible. And that,
That's
6,000 meters is mind blowing for a marine mammal to dive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's like to hold their breath for that long. Like
Yeah.
that's got to take hours to go down.
They move pretty quick.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how long it takes, but I think I don't have the number offhand, but
Yeah.
it's either 200 minutes or 20 minutes for the 3,000 meter dive. I'm guessing probably closer to 200, but don't quote me on that as we
20 minutes,
record a
that's
podcast.
That's fast.
But,
yeah. But it could be. You never know. Yeah.
yeah, but we can look it up later. I don't have that number offhand.
Yeah. No worries.
But yeah, that would be an incredible accomplishment for a marine mammal. There's other animals that use these areas for nursery grounds. So we have confirmed documentation now of skates that use diffuse flow hydrothermal vents to incubate their eggs. So they lay their eggs around these diffuse flow vents, and it does two things. The extra warmth helps the eggs develop faster, so they hatch quicker, so they're less at risk of predation. And then because the plume is pretty nasty, a lot of predatory animals don't like to be around them, and so it offers a little bit of a protective barrier as well. So you've got skates that do that. You also have octopuses. Convention on migratory species isn't particularly concerned with octopuses, but we do know that there are octopuses that have nursery grounds around diffuse flow hydrothermal vents as well. So there is direct habitat use for some of these animals.
Well, and going back to the skates, that was I had Dr. David Ebert, who was on that paper. The skates in the Pacific. He'll kill me that I don't remember the name, but it's quite a cool story when we had him on a few years ago to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of impacts directly to the animals, so there's this plume, and there's a benthic plume. How much that's going to impact like a migratory species 4,000 or 5,000 meters above, not entirely clear. Midwater plume, though, is being discharged in an area where we have this tremendous diel vertical migration. And that is a diel vertical migration of prey species for lots and lots and lots of fish in the ocean, and whales, and dolphins, and turtles, and everything else that likes to prey on midwater organisms. And so, we're thinking about disruption to not necessarily the migratory species behavior, but also to the behavior of their prey. So if that prey behavior is impacted, or if they're accumulating heavy metals as they're migrating up through this plume, and then those heavy metals bioaccumulate in the predator species, that becomes a pretty substantial problem down the line for these very migratory species. More direct impacts are this entire process is very noisy. There's been estimates where the volume of the riser and lift system, so the actual pumping of ore up, which is a sound column that goes the entire water column and permeates out through the ocean, because sound travels very well in the ocean. There are estimates that it could be up to 120, 125 decibels, which is way beyond the recommended safe range for marine mammals. And it's a chronic sound. It's not like, with ground penetrating or seafloor penetrating sonar, it's a tremendously traumatic experience for animals that are nearby, but it's quick. It's one big pulse, and then it's done.
One boom. Yeah.
With the riser and lift system, this is a continuous system. That noise is going to be generated throughout the entire mining operation, which could be years. And so we don't
and across
really
the entire
know.
water column too, right?
Exactly.
It's not just like one part of the water column; it's the entire water column.
Yeah. So we don't really know what the impact of chronic noise at that level has on cetaceans and other snifferous species. So lots of animals use sound to navigate. They use sound to hunt. They use sound to communicate. And, we have some good studies on, acute sound impacts where you generate a really, really fast, high volume noise. We have a few studies on the impacts of dredging operations. So kind of that low, deep rumble that comes when you're operating a dredge. But even those are days to weeks, not months to years. So the impact of this kind of sustained high volume sound across the whole water column is something that has not really been studied in any kind of detail.
And also, if you think about it too, it's interesting how you talk about the entire water column's affected, especially with noise. We know that there are marine mammals that use noise to communicate, to feed, to hunt, and all that kind of stuff. They will avoid areas with noise. We've seen it happen before. Will they avoid this area? We don't know. But they've in the past, certain marine mammal species will avoid areas that have noise. Now, the one thing about the guns, like these seismic guns and acoustic guns, is that, like you said, they kind of sneak up on you and they come in and they go regular pace, but it's still, it's a pulse. It's not like a continuous. So it kind of almost, you can, a marine mammal, you can almost argue that it gets sucked in, not knowing that this noise is here, and then it gets exposed to this noise. Obviously, there's rules and regulations around that, but it's hard to avoid. With a chronic one that's happening, though, you're just going to get you can almost, this research needs to be done, which we'll talk about at the end of this episode, but you can probably look at with a chronic noise is just going to be avoidance, altogether. And we know that marine mammals are in areas like the Clarendon Clipper Zone, so we know that they feed off there. And so if they avoid that because of noise, then how are they going to feed? Like it's just this problem, this continuous problem that happens, even though we don't know for sure, but the prediction could be there based on other research and so forth.
Well, if you imagine if your favorite restaurant was right next to a construction site, you just stop going to that restaurant.
Exactly.
And if that was, what if that was the only taco place in town?
Yep.
Then that would be a tragedy because you wouldn't be able to get any tacos.
You wouldn't be able to get any tacos. You'd have to go to the next town over. And that's the thing. Sure. And then you're looking at, they're already, all these marine mammals are already they're under enough stress with climate change and finding food, and their food patterns are changing in a lot of areas. Now we're looking at another direct human-caused disturbance that they could avoid this area altogether.
So climate change also came up as a confounding factor in all of this because one of the things that is happening is as the world is heating up and as ocean currents are changing, these migratory species migration routes change. And so we identified several cases where there isn't currently any known interaction, but as we see these range expansions happening, we can see where 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we're going to start seeing many more encounters between certain marine species and deep sea mining sites. One of the big examples is the Kemp's Ridley turtle. Kemp's Ridley turtles, they usually hang out in the Gulf of Mexico and the U.S. East Coast. Nice, comfortable, protected, lovely. But they're also starting to turn up in Europe. We found them as far as the Netherlands. So they are undergoing a range expansion now. Too. Yeah. And so if they're crossing the Atlantic, then they're crossing those same lease plots that the eels are crossing. And so there's a very real possibility that, the problems we think are going to be the big problems today are not going to be the big problems in 20 years because these animals are changing where they're going. And they're 100%. Changing where they're going because we're changing the climate.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. I can see it being a confounding factor. Taking a bite out of sort of the survivability, as we go through and look at these animals. That's interesting. So so we got marine mammals. We can see how they can be affected. Noise, we can see affected prey that might go down. They might be chasing prey down into the deep or into at least the mid column. Now let's talk about I guess the animal that would probably be the extreme opposite that I would think would be seabirds, right? Seabirds fly in the air, they come down to feed, but they're going to try and get back into the air. How would they be affected? I can see prey right off the bat, but how else would they be affected? Or if they
we looked at all the migratory birds and all the ranges covered by the CMS, and it's only about 7% of birds covered by CMS that would interact with known marine mining sites, but it's all the major families of seabirds, which is not a surprise. So you're talking about things like wandering albatrosses and petrels and a lot of these big ocean-spanning birds that spend most of their life in the air. And so you'd think, okay, there probably won't be a ton of interactions there, but a few things really interesting happen when you have a ship on station for a long period of time. In the case of a mining operation, we're talking years. Ship becomes a fish aggregating device. You've been out to sea, you've seen it. So when you've got a ship on station and you sit there for a month, there are tons of fish underneath you. If you're there for a year, even more. And so there's a question of if you have predatory seabirds, Now you are creating feeding sites for them. Is that going to negatively impact them? We have studies from offshore oil and gas where oil rigs are attractant to a lot of seabirds. So they'll come in the land, and then it will disrupt their migration patterns. And, if you're an albatross and you land somewhere where you don't have a big enough runway to take off again, you can't fly. Because albatrosses are nature's least effective bird that can actually fly.
They are massive too, but yes.
They're massive. They need a long run. I mean, I've seen albatrosses break their legs on landing. They're not like...
Yeah. They're not built for They may be built for the flight. They're not built for
Evolution is nothing kind to them.
Gotcha.
But, so you have this bird attractant. On the other hand, when you look at offshore wind farms, birds tend to avoid them. The big seabirds tend to not go near the offshore wind farms. And so... we don't know, are these mining vessels going to act more like oil rigs? Probably be more like oil rigs. Or is it going to be more like an offshore wind farm? Right. They produce a lot of light at night, so that's going to be attractant to seabirds. But in terms of the groups of animals that are going to suffer the most consequences from deep sea mining, seabirds are not high on that list, I think.
Okay.
Generally speaking, they wouldn't be my first point of concern. My first point of concern would be the cetaceans.
Yeah.
Sea turtles, less so sharks, other than for like the essential nursery ground issues and for those specific feeding sites. And then I talk a lot about eels because I just found the eel story so fascinating. The reality is that I think eels have a lot more things to worry about before they.
Well, they're an endangered species too, right?
Yes,
my understanding.
They're very threatened, and it's a threatened fishery. And they're very highly managed, and they're facing a lot of environmental challenges right now. It's a shame if deep sea mining adds to that, but I think the greatest threats from deep sea mining are the threats to the cetaceans,
Agreed.
And threats to sea turtles. The other thing that happens that we haven't talked about yet is ship strikes. So these mining operations are not happening in areas that have a lot of ship traffic. But if you are, like some of the companies have proposals where they have barges coming in and out to offload nodules or to offload ore and bring it back to shore. So you're talking about, several ships a week, maybe several ships a day, depending on the scale of the mining operation that they're offloading into. Now you've dramatically increased the number of vessels in the area. Yeah. And that dramatically increases the risk of ship strikes to whales, to dolphins, and to sea turtles. The good news with ship strikes is we know how to avoid ship strikes. Like there are protocols in place that you can implement to reduce the risk of ship strikes. And the challenge there is convincing mining contractors that, hey, if you're going to be running a lot of boats out here, and we know that whales migrate through this area, and especially like the CCZ, we know for sure because we've got those feeding gouges. We also have one of the mining companies was nice enough to put out acoustic moorings, both at depth and at the surface. And so we have a lot of very lovely recordings of dolphin whistles, and minke whale calls and sperm whale clicks. So we do know that cetaceans are very active in that area. And so, if you're operating in an area where you know that cetaceans are going to be, you got to slow your boats down. You got to have continuous, persistent monitoring, and you got to, keep it low, keep it slow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things like that we don't really realize is happening. I think a lot of times we think of just the operation itself, down at the bottom. We don't realize the logistics of getting ships there, getting ships like situated on there, how long they're going to be there, how they're getting the ore up to the boat, the noise that's around it, the lights. There's a lot of when you look at it in a proper study like you did, and look at these effects, we see that these animals can be effective. Now this is very localized areas too, right? Like these are going to be ships in the middle of the sea. Is it going to be one ship? Is it going to be many ships? Like, how do you think this is going to play out from what you know about these deep sea mining operations?
So, if you look at the projections for the scale of the industry, and you take their most optimistic projections, in the near future, if deep sea mining goes forward, it's going to be probably one mining vessel, two mining vessels operating in the Pacific at any one time, with support vessels coming in and out. But to actually meet the resource demands that deep sea mining companies claim that they can meet, to functionally outcompete the Democratic Republic of the Congo for production of cobalt. You're talking about 30 vessels operating in areas that cover hundreds of thousands of acres of seafloor.
It's going to be like small cities.
So it can be, I mean, it's a mega project. It is, it is on the scale of building some of the biggest dams in the world. It is on the scale of some of the biggest engineering projects that humans have ever undertaken. It's huge if it gets all the way to scale. Whether or not deep sea mining reaches the scale that is predicted in the most optimistic projections is definitely something that remains very much tenuous. I think the most likely thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just before you go on to the next. When you mention it, I think of the sort of the oil and gas field in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Yeah. Just south of Louisiana, where you used to see all these oil platforms, and they look like a city. That's what I'm picturing. Is that what you're thinking? If it gets to full scale, like we're going to see that, but it's boats, essentially.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to see that likely in the next 10 or 20 years, I think.
Right. It would have to be.
Even if it does progress at its current pace, it's still going to be a slow developing industry, and it's still got a lot to prove, and there's a lot of technology that's still up in the air. So, one of the beautiful things, and I've said this before, one of the great things about this current moment is that, never before in history have we started an extractive industry by leading with environmental principles, by leading with regulations. We almost never have the opportunity to figure out what the harm is going to be before we go in and begin extracting and exploiting. And so I think we have a real opportunity now, and this is pedal to the metal at the moment for making sure that we know everything we possibly can before the first ounce of commercial ore is lifted from the seafloor. But this is our moment to really figure out, okay, what do we know? What don't we know? How is this industry going to affect the global ocean? And what can we do to make sure that we don't cause lasting harm to the ocean in pursuit of, temporary material gains?
Amazing. Now, with all the information that you came up with, there's still a lot of information that we don't know. Can you talk
this is a knowledge gap study. The entire study is about what we don't know.
So how do we progress in an assessment where we don't have a lot of information? How does that get progressed to ensure that these species that we're talking about are going to be protected from the implications and the consequences of deep sea mining?
So at the international level, and this is a UN report by a UN agency, so it's working on international issues that, some countries like the United States of America are not as engaged on as others. But in the international arena, the Convention on Migratory Species is having their COP, their Convention of the Parties, in February. They will adopt a set of recommendations about research priorities and management priorities that they want to see reflected in the mining code. And they will liaise with the International Seabed Authority about how their priorities and their needs get implemented into the code being developed by the International Seabed Authority. For the vast majority of countries in the world that are party to both the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and the Convention on Migratory Species, which is most countries, the U.S. being the big exception to that rule. We never ratified UNCLOS. So most countries will be beholden to those decisions. Unfortunately, some countries won't, and that will require campaigning within your country if you are a citizen of a country that is not party to those treaties.
Right. Interesting. So, the research that's going to come out after this, are people watching this study? Are people looking at this study? Are the researchers being like, okay, this is how we are going to look at it in the future? And does funding allow to, fill those gaps?
So yes, there are research institutions and countries. So the study itself was sponsored by Australia and Monaco. So they have a very big interest in determining what their research priorities should be. But the recommendations themselves go through the ISA, and so then the ISA comes back and says, okay, understanding impacts on highly migratory species is a necessary part of the environmental impact assessment that a mining contractor has to conduct. So now this also has to be a part of their environmental studies as well.
Gotcha.
So it is a way to ensure that the data is being collected by the mining companies beforehand. Because right now, no one's really collecting a ton of data about highly migratory species. We actually went through the deep data database, which is maintained by the ISA, to look at all the actual records of highly migratory species, and it was less than 20.
Really?
Yeah. So no one's like, and most of them were identified to like family level. Some of them to like phyla level.
Yeah. So when you really include those,
yeah, like there were groups that was just like the lowest taxonomic identification was avian. Which, birds. Fair. If it's a bunch of geologists on a mining boat, they don't know what a bird is. Like,
no, true.
Like, you can't, but you see, you can't expect people to anticipate ahead of time, like, all the things we're going to need to know. That's something that develops as the industry matures. And so, being able to say, you should have someone on your boat that can identify an albatross.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's be a useful thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think, when you look at the regulations, so you mentioned, this goes to the ISA. The ISA kind of says, okay, we're going to they're going to look at it, and hopefully they adopt it as part of like the assessments that are done by each country, or each, I guess, operator within each, like whatever area that they're doing, whether it's the high seas or it's in a country. Does the ISA have the ability to enforce that? To say, hey, you guys have to get these consultants who know birds and know marine mammals, and they're going to start looking at what's around while you're doing your exploration and all that kind of stuff. Like, do they have? From my understanding, is they don't have that authority. And based on
the ISA has no enforcement capacity right now. They have an enforcement mandate. They don't have enforcement capacity. This would be more of a these are the kinds of requirements that we need from an environmental impact assessment, and then that assessment gets reviewed by the ISA and gets signed off on or rejected, depending on whether or not they hit a certain level of benchmarks. That being this is all politics at that level. Yeah, and so there will be many delegations that'll be arguing, no, we must know exactly what is happening to our sperm whales, and there will be delegations going, we don't really care that much about wandering albatrosses, and so that will be part of a discussion that happens at the ISA if these recommendations get presented there.
Interesting. When I did a lot of work when I was at school, my master's was actually on looking at marine protected areas on the Scotia itself, and we looked at macroinvertebrates, big macroinvertebrates, and looking at where they were. So we're looking at like what was expected to see there, and if there were assemblages around there. We call them like the representative areas of like what dominated, what species dominated a community, what was the makeup, was it different from others, and so forth. And of course, the demersal fish study was done as well. But then we never, the other side of it was like the distinct areas and the distinct species, like the migratory species, where they go, like upwellings and so forth, and like nursery areas and spawning sites and so forth. But the migratory species were the hardest, because it's like, how do you protect migratory species when things move and their their prey moves, their habitats move, because they're done by like these large processes that move with currents, and now we talked earlier about climate change, that will move and everything like that. Is it more difficult to protect these species because or these types of species, as you mentioned, like we don't even know which species specifically we're talking about? I'm sure we can come up with a list, but is it complicated because these are migratory species and not just like, say, the benthic species that would be found directly underneath the site or in the site that they're exploring?
Oh, absolutely. And part of the problem is because they're migratory, there's a seasonality to that, right? So if you are, doing a proper high endurance environmental campaign to really characterize the impacts of a mining company, you could be talking about a research cruise that takes 3 months. Like 3 months is a long research cruise. Yeah. If you do that research cruise in the summer and humpback whales migrate through the area in the winter, you're just never going to see them, and you'll never quantify that at all. So you have to cross-reference with like known migration patterns and things like that, and very specifically think about that kind of thing. And that gets to another problem. Like if noise is driving, say, beaked whales away from the CCZ, but you never observe beaked whales because they're only there in October and you only sample in August. You don't know that you've driven them away because you just never see them.
Yeah.
And so, it does get very, very challenging. Beaked whales are a great example. Beaked whales probably make up a quarter of all whale species. And we've identified very few of them. We know precious little about the behavior and ecology of beaked whales. They're one of the most understudied whales in the world, and they are one of the most abundant groups of whales in the ocean. So it is very hard to get information, even though these are the big animals. These are most of them are the big animals. Some of them are tiny, but these are the big animals. And even with the big animals, it's very hard to get that kind of information because they're so mobile, because they're moving around so much, and because we're operating and talking about areas of the high seas where the high seas in general does not get studied as much as coastal waters, just because people live on land.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's an interesting thing. We're looking at the high seas. The High Seas Treaty has actually been ratified as of this year, which
biodiversity
is
beyond national jurisdiction.
Unreal. With
it
that
has entered
said,
into force, ratified by 60 countries.
60 countries, and probably more after this, I assume.
Yes.
Now, that's
notably not the United States.
No,
not yet.
The United States, not yet. No.
We've signed it. We haven't ratified it. Just like UNCLOS.
How is that going to? Do you think that's obviously going to play a role in the future of deep sea mining and looking at the high seas and managing the high seas? Where do you see that? I know it's kind of like a prediction question, but where do you see that policy coming in for deep sea mining, or has there already been like a clause within the treaty on deep sea mining already? As they made it up.
I think where it lands is the creation of a new kind of conflict. So, at its core, the Biodiversity Treaty recognizes biodiversity as a resource, as a resource to be protected and exploited, just like a mineral resource. That's a gross oversimplification of what the treaty actually does, but it does treat biodiversity itself as a resource. And so, once we start thinking about biodiversity in the deep sea as, something to protect as a resource rather than something to protect as a thing that we love because biology is awesome, I think that creates new conflicts because it creates conflicts with people who want, biodiversity has value to ecosystems, which can be quantified as financial value. And in some cases, that financial value of, the environmental value of keeping an ecosystem intact may vastly exceed the value of the minerals underneath. There's a pharmaceutical value that's tied with biodiversity. That I don't like to get into because bioprospecting is a tenuous thing and a really fascinating and interesting industry that doesn't always function exactly the way we think it does in terms of how discovery works. Right. But it's important to recognize that we do gain a lot from the deep sea that is scientific, that is cultural, but is also financial, and it's intangible financial. So it's not something where you can say, we picked up 8 ounces of cobalt and it's worth X dollars. It's something where you can say, we gained this new insight into how a certain protein can function at high temperatures, and now we have PCR and have revolutionized the $30 trillion medical industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a difficult way to quantify it, but I think one of the things that the High Sea Treaty does really well is get us to think in terms of what that value really means to us, beyond just the material value of the animals or the minerals.
Interesting. Where do we go from here? Like the study's been done. Obviously there's a lot of gaps that need to be filled. What's the next step when we look at deep sea mining and we look at migratory species?
We're gonna need a boat.
A big boat.
No, I mean the next step, because this is a knowledge gap study. This is understanding where the gaps in our knowledge are. I want to know how sound is going to impact migratory marine species, especially whales. So, we need to figure out ways to do proxy studies. Like, obviously, we can't just annoy whales for 2 years and see what happens. But we have to find places where we can, use as proxies examples from offshore dredging, offshore drilling, and see if we can't get a little bit more clarity on that. For some of the big target things, like some of it is going to be working with mining companies because they're the ones operating out there and having observers on their boats and documenting and putting out acoustic moorings. There's a lot of, it's research. This is, one of the fun things about this project is just imagining all the different kinds of research projects you can do just based on the sort of identified knowledge gaps here. I want to be going around to as many diffuse flow hydrothermal vent sites as I can and seeing, who's using what as a nursery ground. That's such a wild thing that we weren't looking for before. And now that we know what to look for, just being like, okay, how common is this phenomenon?
It's an interesting perspective, like to look at all this stuff. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of graduate studies that can happen from this and fund a lot of projects. And it's going to have to be like, I assume a lot of the deep sea mining companies are going to have to foot the bill for this type of work to kind of like fill those gaps.
The nice thing about this kind of work is that it's not the expensive stuff. The expensive stuff is giant robots on the seafloor.
Right.
Having an observer on your boat that can identify birds is true. A rounding error in your daily operating budget, right? Yeah. Putting out acoustic moorings to listen for marine mammals is, they're already putting out moorings to look for other oceanographic conditions. They can add acoustic moorings to those. In terms of recommendations that are not particularly expensive for the amount of science you get out of them, the beauty of a whale is you don't need a microscope.
That is true. And with the advent of like drones and stuff like that, you can go a lot further out from your boat. In terms of sightings, it's not just binoculars, a pair of binoculars, and somebody there. You can actually go above and beyond and see where they are and their where they tend to go, where they if they're avoiding or not, and check those patterns.
Exactly, or a helicopter, as we talked about earlier. We both love helicopters so much.
We'll be on the boat. Watching the helicopters. Like, yeah, you're right over there. That's good. That's cool. Is this like, so if, there's a lot of researchers that want to participate in this type of work, would love to, I mean, myself included, would love to do that. Is this like an advent of like a new conglomerate of studies, do you think? If you're looking at somebody who's trying to get into graduate work and they want to start to look at this kind of stuff, where's the start? I mean, it's such a broad topic and there's so many species and so forth, but where would you recommend people begin to look into this kind of stuff?
So, the things that are coming down the pipeline, if you're in the United States, there's going to be, science investment right now is at a historic low.
Right.
But there is going to be investment in deep sea mining. And so if you're interested in understanding the environmental impacts of deep sea mining, or if you're just interested in studying these kinds of highly migratory species in the ocean, deep sea mining's not a bad hook to get yourself in the door in terms of funding. I don't know what the funding calls will look like coming out of this because I don't know what the CMS process is coming out of this. I would suspect that there will be, different countries will set different priority areas, and some of them will include these. So keeping an eye out for that. The reality is I'm still a deep sea ecologist that works at hydrothermal vents and loves to look at snails. And so, I don't foresee myself being super involved in a lot of the downstream studies, but I am absolutely, a social node that loves connecting people to other people. So I'm happy to work with researchers to figure out who's doing what.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see what people come up with. Obviously, it's catapulting from this study will be huge. We have to find out as much as possible before DC mining, gets underway a lot faster and a lot more consistently than it has been in the future. When there are a couple of I know it's not really the topic per se, but there are a couple of projects that are going on right now that are being proposed in U.S. territories. CNMI is one of them. I believe Samoa is the other.
So there have been BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has issued 2 RFIs in the last several months. So requests for information about resources and interest in areas off of American Samoa and areas off of the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. The American Samoa one has closed. They received something like 76,000 comments, most of which were very negative.
Right.
A lot of them coming from people in American Samoa.
Yeah.
So, the folks who live out there, and, generally speaking, like, my highest priority when looking at potential deep sea mining is, do the people most directly impacted by it, do the people who live nearby, are the actual indigenous stakeholders on board, or are they opposed? That's that's the make or break for any of these. That can happen. Like the Cook Islands has been interested in looking at deep sea mining. If the Cook Islanders decide they want to mine their own waters, I have nothing bad to say about that. Indigenous sovereignty is an absolute in things like that. At the moment, the people of American Samoa sure don't seem like they want to see deep sea mining off their coasts, and you will see from the current RFI how the people of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands feel too. But that one's a strange one because there's not particularly valuable ore deposits in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. There's some, but there's not a ton, and it's also the Mariana Trench. So it's from a political standpoint, like if I were a mining company, the last thing I'd want to be associated with mining the only deep sea feature in the world that everyone can recognize. Right? You do not want to be the guy that mined the Mariana Trench. Like that's just, especially for not particularly valuable ore deposits. That's just not like, from a PR standpoint, that just seems like a bad move.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're surprised at this?
I'm surprised the RFI went out, and apparently no one requested it. So it seems like BOEM is just trying to assess all of its resources for potential future lease sales.
Now, as of this recording, that comment period is still open. Anybody can comment, or is it just more of the people of the CNMI?
Anyone can comment. U.S. citizens, generally, unless you have specific expertise. So I'm working with a group of international scientists to put in a comment from the international community because they have particular expertise in that area. But generally speaking, anyone is allowed to comment. They really want to hear from U.S. citizens. And the people of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands are also U.S. citizens, of course.
Of course, yeah.
One of the many territories that the empire continues to hold.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much. We'll put links down so that people can get access to those comments as long as they're open. And I highly recommend that if you are qualified to put out a comment, please do. It's really important that you get your say in, especially if you're listening here from the CNMI or from American Samoa. It's always good to hear, in your own backyard. It's happening in your own backyard. So, but yeah, thank you, Andrew. This has been amazing as usual. This is always fun to have you on the podcast, and you always bring so much information. We really appreciate it. Such an important topic too. So we really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing this with us.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be on here.
You bet. One more thing, if people want to get to know you a little bit more and connect with you, there's southernfriedscience.com, but where else can people go to learn more about your projects?
I exist on Southern Fried Science, and I exist on Blue Sky at Dr. Andrew Thaler.
Awesome. And I know you won't do this, but I'm going to do this for you. Please support Andrew on Patreon. He's up to so many different things that are not traditionally funded or not traditionally paid for by other things, but it's such an important things like creating the Open CTD line of products, doing D&D with people in his own town and kids and stuff on forestry. We're talking about being on a climate change commission, in his own town, doing I forget the name of it. What's the tide gauge that you put in?
The Smart Buoy, the St. Michael Smart Buoy.
Smart Buoy. Like, Andrew is up to so many different things. Innovative, very technology focused, very important, always on the right side of history. I highly recommend. I'm going to put the link in there if you don't mind, Andrew, so that people can go and support them if they choose and are able to. I highly recommend that you do. Again, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Happy to come back anytime.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining us again here on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on, as usual, and I can't wait to have you back on to talk about all the other projects, especially deep sea mining, that you are focused on. It's always great to be able to share this information, especially from an expert like yourself who's been working on this for more than a decade, and I think it's really important that we talk about these issues. I'm going to put links to the public comment for the CNMI. If you want to do that comment or make that comment, please do so as soon as possible. I think it's still open. And for those of you who watch this after, continue to come back and watch these episodes, because I'm going to be doing more advocacy action. Like if you want to put in a public comment or if you want to contribute in some kind of way, I'll have links to help you to do that and offer you resources to do that, because I think it's really important in today's day that we are able to advocate for the ocean, learn about science and conservation and restoration of ocean habitats like seagrasses, but also just like everything else, like deep sea mining and so forth. It's really important to the people that live around these areas where they don't want this to happen. So always great to be able to talk to Andrew. Always great to be able to provide this information from Andrew directly to you through our conversations. It's the whole point of the podcast, to provide a resource for people who don't have that resource handy. It's just freely accessible. It's all for you. For those of you who want to donate to help launch another podcast, you can go to speakupforblue.com/seagrass. But until then, I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. Oh, by the way, if you want to leave a comment, leave it below in this YouTube video. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app like Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, whatever that might be, please contact me at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram, or go to speakupforblue.com/contact. Fill out the form. It goes right to my email. I'd be more than happy to answer it. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.